Welcome to Embroidered Bag Workshop Lesson 4. So we're going to talk a little bit today about getting your design for your embroidery onto your applique. You should have your applique down and ready to go. In this case, it's the dog that I used. I traced around this and created this applique out of it. I got this dog pattern out of my Celtic art book. There's a ton of stuff in here. And just line drawing. I went ahead and took just one of the motifs, created my applique, ironed it down, and then stitched it down. But I also kept this as a sort of a primer. One of the ways that I like to get the interior, the embroidery lines on, is I like to use this heat transfer pencil. So you would draw your drawing, and then you'd flip it over and trace it with this pencil. And that can then be flipped back over and ironed onto your applique, and it just creates an iron-on transfer. That's one of my favorites. I also like chalk pencils, especially for dark fabric. I use a lot of templates, so I draw around templates a lot. These templates are a cardboard, and I just go ahead and draw around them if I want to go ahead and embroider just that and not have an applique, or embroider inside of appliques. So you can see I've used a lot of chalk pencils. This is a really tiny one. But chalk on dark fabric works really well. This is a quilter's pencil, transfer pencil, same kind of thing. I also use just basic chalk. That's one of my favorites for freehanding things. So another strategy that I use when I'm freehanding is I use these gel pens. Gel pens are actually really good for embroidery because while they stay on long enough for you to embroider, they actually disappear after a while. So that's pretty cool. And then I have these lovely, some of these are pens that they go away after a few hours. Or you have to take water and get rid of them. This one in particular has a nice tip to it. This is another nice tip. So these are just strategies that I use to kind of get the stuff inside that I want to embroider on. I'm going to freehand this one because it doesn't really need to be heat transferred. I'm just going to go ahead and lay these lines in. And I use my primer for a lot of that. And because this is water soluble, if I make a mistake, I just wipe it off. Some of these pens work better than others on fabrics. Wool is woolly, obviously, so I like to use this bigger felt tip and really get stuff in here. And of course, this doesn't work on dark fabric, but the chalk and other things will work on dark fabric. So I'm just going to go ahead and get these lines in there, make sure that I've got everything in, and just give myself an idea of where I'm going to be going. And then make sure that everything looks good, and I think I'm ready to start embroidering. Yep, I'm ready. So in the previous lesson we talked a little bit about color, but I wanted to go over that just a real quick sec again. I usually start out with 3 different colors that look good together on whatever I'm doing. And that's only because I like to have choices. Sometimes I use 3, sometimes I use 4, sometimes I only use 2. But mostly, like on this particular project, what I want to do is I want to make sure that this all sort of ties together. And so what I've done is I've chosen a yellow that matches that yellow and a cream that matches that cream, because leaving it just black was just way too much. I wanted it to kind of sink in. So I went ahead and just used various things, and then I added a red and I added a green, and the red and the green sort of pulled it together into the kingdom look to it. So that's kind of my strategy, is to see what everything is and sort of pick colors from, I guess you'd call it the environment. But usually 3 colors gives me enough choice, and sometimes 4. So that's kind of what I've done here, is I've just picked these 3 colors. They look good on this bag, and they're going to sort of pop on top of the red as well as pop on top of the white. And I've given myself some choice, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this one. I've already loaded up this needle, and I think I'm going to go ahead and work on some of the outlines and other things. But first, stitches. Okay, so I went ahead and uploaded last week. I uploaded this PDF of these very simple stitches for you. They've got all the stitches, they're fairly period. There's a nice little Viking stitch there. These are some of the stitches I'm going to go ahead and show you in the rest of this video. I use these exclusively. I don't use much else unless I find something that's interesting. So I've loaded up my needle, and there's two lines of thought here on the whole knot or not to knot kind of thing. They knotted their thread and period, but if you're embroidering a shirt and you don't have a backing, you're going to knot. So basically, here's how to knot. Take 2 stitches in, pull through, and then stitch back over it, catching the thread as you go, kind of like a sewing machine. And that's pretty sturdy. It doesn't come out very easy. But this is a bag, and so I'm going to go ahead and just knot it because nobody's going to see these knots. Again, if you're embroidering something that isn't going to be lined, you might want to consider not putting knots in. But this is going to be lined, so it's not really a huge issue. So let's get that started. And go to the front here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a running stitch. I like running stitch. It's easy, and it goes pretty fast, and it adds a lot of color. I like running stitch kind of outside of not right next to the applique, but kind of outside. So let me go ahead and jump out a little bit here. You notice I'm not going all the way through the fabric and then back out. With the running stitch, it's not really necessary on wool. And the running stitch, the top stitch should be a little bit wider than the bottom stitch so that you have a little bit more color on top than on the bottom. And basically it is just, as it says, a running stitch. I like this one for a lot of Celtic and Norse stuff because it's sort of reminiscent of some of the illumination and some of the other like rock structures and whatnot. I use this a lot to outline when I'm done because it thickens the whole applique up without actually thickening it up. As you can see, it adds some pop of color and it's kind of nice. Yeah, I have to admit that Satin Stitch is my least favorite stitch, but it's a good stitch to know, especially if you have things that you're going to fill. Like the dog's eye, I'm going to fill that. I might even fill the muzzle too, but right now I'm just going to show you the filling of the eye. I've gone ahead and started and I knotted it. So I'm coming up just on the outside of the eye, and I'm starting kind of in a corner. Now, I like to slant my satin stitch a little bit rather than going back and up and down, up and down. The slant kind of gives it a little bit more of a textural value. Now, most books are going to tell you that you go back down and start at the bottom again and work your way around. And so basically you're doing a sort of circular stitching kind of thing. That is a huge, huge waste of thread, and it also adds a lot of tension that's not necessary. So I just come back up alongside where I went back down. And you have to be a little careful, otherwise you come back in the same hole. But I just go ahead and come back down and then go down at the very bottom of the first one. And what this does is it puts thread only on the top and very small stitches on the back so that you're not wasting thread and you're not causing a huge tension issue. One of the reasons why I don't like satin stitch is because it's just very floaty and it catches on things, and it does cause tension issues unless you're really careful. You'll notice I'm not using a hoop. I don't tend to use hoops on wool. I just tend to try and make sure that my my hand tension is good. And so with satin stitch, like I said, it's my least favorite stitch because it does introduce a lot of problems unless you're really, really careful. But for tiny little bits like this, like the dog's eye, it works beautifully. And then you don't have a bunch of little tiny stitches in that eye. I also don't have a bunch of thread on the back either. So for this application, it'll be just fine. And I think that it works. Alright, so I got the eye in there, and now I kind of want to do a stem stitch. Stem stitch is my favorite stitch to outline appliques in because it introduces a nice line of color, but it doesn't take very long. And all I'm doing here is I've got my thread coming up, but then I am taking a stitch and then going backwards. The running stitch went forward, so I'm actually just going backwards with this. And I'm always keeping the thread to one side. That's the key on this. Always keep the thread on one side as you're pulling through. You notice how I grab the loop with my thumb? The key to a good satin stitch, or a good stem stitch, is that you always keep it going the same direction. So I use that thumb a lot to hold things in place. And it's fairly easy, fairly quick. Again, I'm not going all the way through, all the way down and through. It's not necessary with wool. And if you were using satin or linen, it wouldn't be necessary either. You notice my thread is twisting up. This is one of the ways that knots get introduced into your thread. What I do is every about 5 stitches I take a look at my thread and make sure that it's not twisting up or that it's not untwisting. And if it is untwisting, I'll twist it a little bit. If it is twisting up, I'll untwist it a little bit. And I'll just do that all the way through so that I don't get a lot of knots. And see, in stem stitch is pretty quick, pretty easy, and it's a nice, thin, solid line that does a nice job of outlining without overpowering the edge of anything. And so I would probably do this entire dog all the way around. And chain stitch is my favorite. I really like chain stitch a lot. I use it a lot, and I'm probably going to go ahead and use it to fill in the details on this dog. So I'm going to do that section right there. I've already drawn it in. And I'm going to go ahead and come up through where I'm supposed to start. And chain stitch is nothing more than coming up, again, putting that loop where it needs to go, and then going right back down where I came out, taking a bite of fabric, putting the loop under the needle, and then pulling very gently, but not pulling up, pulling out, not up, out, and then putting that loop under my thumb, going back in where I went through in the loop, pulling out, not up, going back through the loop, loop under the needle, pulling out, and so forth and so forth. I find chain stitch to be really quick, really easy, and really versatile. It's a little thicker than stem stitch, which means that it gives a little more weight to whatever it is that you're doing, so you have to be a little careful with it. But when you really want to cruise on details, I just find chain stitch to be pretty marvelous. It's also a great stitch as like a leaping off stitch for other things, because then you can interlace it. Chain stitch can be done all over everything, and then you can wrap it. It's just a really versatile stitch, and it's pretty easy to accomplish. And it's pretty fast, too. Even having to sit there and make sure that I load the loop the way I'm supposed to, it's still pretty fast. Now I'm going to get to the end of here, and I'm going to show you how to tie this off. It's pretty easy. All you have to do is get to the end, and you put in your last loop here. One more. All right, so instead of going back down into the loop, all I'm going to do is go on the outside of the loop and tack it down. And that's it. All right, let's talk about buttonhole stitch. I use buttonhole stitch to tack this applique down, but it's in a very light thread. You probably can't see it very well. But if I had wanted to, I could have used this embroidery, pearl embroidery, to do the same thing, and that would have given it a sort of stem line on the outside and some interesting feature along the edge. And all buttonhole stitches, you take that first stitch, you notice where I'm putting the loop. I'm putting the loop underneath. I'm only taking a bite of fabric, keeping the loop underneath. It's kind of like chain in that regard. I'm keeping those little legs about the same width. Going down through, I make sure I catch both fabrics. I'm going down through again, loop underneath. Oh, there's a knot. I'm pulling. One more. Now, when you get to a corner here, you don't want to just move around the corner. There's a trick to doing corners. So I don't want to move around the corner because that sometimes the thread will move around a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go on the outside, kind of like the chain up there, and tack it down, and then come back up on the inside of it so that I have it all neatly tied in place before I start the next section. And the next section just starts up the same way. And then I'll just go all the way around this applique. I probably won't because I've already done the other way, but this would be some method of actually doing embroidery and tacking down the applique at the same time. It just depends on how you feel about whether or not you want it to be a design feature. Alright, so along with chain stitch, I also like open chain stitch. I'm going to show you the first way. This is the way that's on the handout, and then I'm going to show you a cool second way. Let me just get it started here. I'm not going to worry too much about it. So, chain stitch, instead of going right back where you came out, you go over a little bit and you pull. So it opens that up a little bit, but don't pull it completely. Jog back around so that you're doing kind of a ladder-like sort of structure. Make sure that loop is under where it's supposed to be. And you're just going to go back and forth, back and forth. So now instead of going where you came out, you just go over to the side a little bit. It's just like chain, but you're not going back in where you came out, you're just going over to the side a little bit. I like this because it can really add a lot of color without adding a lot of thread. Satin Stitch just adds a ton of thread, even if you're doing it the way that I showed you. So you tie this off kind of like the other chain stitch. And there it is. It looks like a little ladder. It's kind of cute. But if you want something even funner, you do the same thing with this other stitch, but instead of keeping that loop open, you let it close up a little bit, and then you do go back over to where you started. Put the loop under, and what this does is introduces diagonals instead of straight across. I like this one because it really almost looks like knotwork. I use this quite a bit. Again, it introduces a lot of color without a lot of thread. And that's kind of the name of the game for me when I'm using thread. I don't want to use a ton of thread that probably won't be seen like the Satin Stitch. See? So that's kind of nice. And lots of color, lots of bang for the buck. Alright, one last stitch. This is the Ossen Stitch. I'm going to show you this, even though you may not be able to get what I'm trying to do here. This is a close cousin of the Van Dyke stitch, and it's used a lot to put seams together by hand. So I have a little stitch that I started. I'm crossing over and making a nice little crossed loop. So it's like a twisted chain stitch in that regard. So I crossed over and I looped through. And then I'm going to go back through underneath that first loop. And you always go from right to left or left to right if you're a lefty. I'm going to go into that loop, pull, and then cross over, and then go in and come out above that stitch, make my second loop. Go through that second loop, cross over, come up. And so that makes a really sort of corded kind of thing going on. Again, it's a real close cousin to the Van Dyke stitch, so once you master this stitch, the Van Dyke stitch will be pretty darn easy. This is found on some Norse clothing as a seam stitch. So you both put the seam together and you make it pretty. Anyway, so that's stitches. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me at laurelyn@recreatedartifacts.com.